Hey guys, so today I wanted to show you something different, which I haven't seen online and I've spent a lot of time trying to get working, which is Pocketbase in Azure. So if you have tried to deploy any sort of Docker image into Azure, you'll know that it's a pain in the ass and it works better on other platforms. No, but in all seriousness, this is going to be a video which I will detail exactly my step-by-step deployment process for how to get Docker working correctly in Azure and also independently of Azure, so you can essentially rip it out and deploy to something else. So while this is more Azure specific because Azure is enterprise, the steps which are in here should be applicable with some tweaking to any platform. So Azure requires us that we have a resource group to begin with, which is essentially a box where we can just throw in all of our resources that we create. Now, from here, we could go through and create everything that we're needing manually. That's not how I like to do it because I think that it's really painful to use. The other reason is that I think that if we use deployment templates, it'll be a lot better. So let's take a look at the code. So first and foremost, this is how I've set up deploying with Azure. We've got our PB hooks file with Docker and we build using Bicep. So if you haven't used Bicep before, Bicep is a way that you can deploy resources into Azure. A very simple version of a Bicep file is this. We've got a parameter, which is what we read in when we've got a parameter, which is what we read in when we call this Bicep file. In this case, it's the location of the actual resource group. And we've also got our name for our ACR. Now, what is ACR? ACR stands for Azure Container Registry. And it's basically the place that your Docker images get registered to. And I'm assuming that everyone here knows what Docker is, but I'm not sure that you know what container registration means. Basically, it is the place where you can register your image. So normally you would upload directly to Docker if you use like Docker Hub or anything like that. But Azure gives us the ability to register our containers privately so that we can have our own registration for that. And I've set it up with two separate Bicep files because we've got the second one is for setting up Kubernetes. Now, Kubernetes seems like a big scary beast, but it's not that scary. And I'll explain why. Kubernetes is used to be able to automate the management of the Docker containers in Azure because managing hardware against your Docker instances can be a little bit annoying. Kubernetes basically allows you to do all of that management and it gives you a bunch of other tools which are very, very useful for managing Docker containers. Like you can go into the container and get the logs very easy, copy things to and from very, very easy with Kubernetes. So let's take a look at this AKS Bicep file, and then we'll look at the steps that we can use to actually run these. So this AKS, which stands for Azure Kubernetes, we have a reference to our existing ACR, which is called from the ACR name. We've got a virtual network, which is just essentially the networking that we use to talk with all of the different containers. It's essential to have that. And then we've got our cluster. Our cluster is essentially the containers, and yeah, we've got ACR for our role assignment, which just basically says that we allow our cluster to pull directly from our container registry, and this allows us to go through and pull images which we've uploaded to our container registry. Now, because this is kind of big and we're just literally just setting up the resources to begin with, we've got a deploy file, which is like a Linux binary. You could do the same thing in Windows and set up like a PowerShell script or something to do this automation, but I've just set up a bash script. Now, this is just to get all of the Azure resources ready. You'll need to actually also get your Kubernetes resources ready, and Kubernetes has a separate deployment file, and that is just a YAML file. And the way that this looks is we set up persistent volumes for our Pocketbase because Pocketbase just runs essentially on a disk. We need to say, look, we need a disk cluster for Pocketbase to run on. And you've got your service, which is being called here. And we go through and rip out this generated ACR and swap in the ACR from which we create in Bicep as part of the deployment script. But this goes through and creates what I've called the access app, which is basically I use Pocketbase as a access layer for different services so that I don't need to use any Microsoft sticky and annoying service. So, and then we also get this load balancer, which basically is a way of accessing our application externally and saying we need an IPv4 assignment on this. So this is pretty much everything that we have in Kubernetes, really container declaration, volume declaration, and a service for accessing via an IP address the actual container itself. There's another few things that I'll get into, but we'll go to our deployment file here and we'll talk through everything. There's a few other things that we could get into here, but we'll just look at our deployment file. So we've got this deployment file here, and we want to essentially break down every part of it. So first and foremost, we set up all of our logging here, as well as with the date. We've got parameters which we use, which is our resource group, which in this case is just our PB group. And we set our cluster name, which can be anything. And we go through and run the deployment template to create Azure container registry, where we store all of our Docker stuff. And then we log in with that container name using, which is the Azure tooling to actually log into it. We jump into Access. We set up Docker on our machine and run these build and tag and push to Azure our Bicep file with our cluster, which basically says we're using this container registry and this cluster name, and then it goes through and builds it directly off of AKS. And then once that's done, we have to run authentication for Kubernetes with our registry, which we go through and do this by going get credentials, and then we update and attach the container directly to Kubernetes. And then the next step is applying the Kubernetes manifest, which is a .yaml file. Our .yaml file will be applied using the kubectl command, which we will then patch, which says now you can run a new deployment, and it will go through and say this deployment was run again. So if you have any additional containers which are added or anything like that, it will go through and pull the latest container. And this is essentially the deployment script. There's a lot going on here, and it seems quite complicated, but it's not. It's actually pretty simple. I think the biggest thing is that it can be kind of annoying because we've got to go through to our deployment YAML and basically copy paste our ACR name. And I think it's kind of fiddly because we've got all of these different components, like we've got Bicep and then Kubernetes all working to go through and run this deployment. But the reason that this works is it allows you to basically automate your entire deployment to the cloud. There's a few little helper commands in here which allow you to go through and add in or check logs and stuff like that. I've put in another manifest here, which is another Kubernetes manifest, which allows us to go through and essentially access our access storage, which we declared up here. We've got this helper function in here, which allows us to go through and access sorry, it's not a helper function, it's a helper container or helper pod, which allows us to go and access the resources within our access container. We can do things like copy files directly to our Pocketbase, so we can copy the database directly to our machine or to a server where we're running the deployments and back. So we can, what the advantage of this would be is if you're provisioning a database environment directly from scratch and you had some data that you wanted to pre-populate in the database, you can do that. We've got exec commands which allow us to jump into Bash, and yeah, these are just some scalable stuff. But let's go through and run our deployment and see what the deploy logs say. So if I get out of here and then run up here to deploy Pocketbase, I think our resource group is PB, so we'll run PB Pocketbase AKS container. We'll check our deploy log, and it says it's deploying ACR. So it starts by deploying the ACR.bicep. which is up here, and then it will go and read the deployment name after it, and it looks like it's created the ACR deployment, and it's run through and authenticated with it. Now it's going to change directory into our access file, build our Docker image, and if there's any problems with actually building a Docker file, and these things apply to any Docker file that you build, you just build it locally and get it working locally first, and then you can deploy to Kubernetes. All of these things are quite iterative in terms of the way that we look at doing deployments. But now that that's done, we'll start deploying our AKS with the brand new images. So now it'll be running up all of these resources, and we can just keep an eye on what's going on here. We can see that those resources are being created. Now we authenticate with Kubernetes locally so that when we run AKS with our kubectl, which is our desktop tool, that it'll work correctly. Now, if we go to services and ingress, we can't see our Pocketbase just yet because it's still doing some stuff on the background. It's really important if you want to make your cluster talk with your container registry, you have to add certain AAD roles. And so that's part of what we have in the script, which happens before we apply the manifest file, which is this stuff here, this AKS update. And we're at this point now where we go through and deploy with our CR name and then apply this deployment. And we'll see very shortly the actual service appear in here. We can see our access services being spun up. We'll notice that we've got our cluster IPs, which are basically internal to Kubernetes. Now we've just got this load balancer, which has just come up, which gives us access via external IP to Pocketbase. So when we open this up, it might take a few secs for the container to load up. Yeah, there you go. We're in Pocketbase. Now, because this is a brand new configured database, we'll probably need to get our logs. So we'll refer to the README here, and then we'll look at our access logs via kubectl, and that will give us this lovely little token that we can just slap on the end here and use to create our first super user. So I think this is really cool stuff. I think that there's a few steps in here which are quite slow, so you probably need to customize your deployment script and maybe have an update script or something like that where you just focus on updating your Kubernetes. That's what I do in my deployments. If you're interested in sort of making Kubernetes interact with Pocketbase and how that interplay works, I can do a subsequent video on that, but I think this is good enough for now. And I'm going to throw, like I said, I'll throw this up and I'll get your guys' feedback. Guys, if you've enjoyed this video, if this video has been helpful to you, I just recommend that you like and subscribe. But more than that, check out my newsletter because I can be even more helpful. I can show you the greatest news and the latest trends, as well as some helpful tools that are helping me improve my developer workflow. Guys, thank you so much for another awesome video, and I'll see you in the next one.